He kept the old truck running for 32 years while everyone said it was dead weight, and the day they finally needed him, he pulled out what no modern rig could touch. What do you do when the experts laugh at your method, and you've been quietly proving them wrong the whole time? My phone rang on a Thursday morning in March 2019. It was my lawyer, Carol Yates. She said the county had reopened the procurement review. I knew exactly what this was about. 7 years earlier, I sat in a folding metal chair in room 14B of the Harlan County Government Center. The chair was cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a pitch that made the back of your teeth ache. The room smelled like old carpet and paper coffee cups. I had driven 40 minutes to be there. The County Fleet Procurement Board met on the second Tuesday of every month. I had been attending for 3 years. My name is Roy Callahan. I am a recovery vehicle operator in Harlan County, Kentucky. I have run a wrecker since I was 18 years old. I am not a loud man. I do not explain myself more than once. I had applied for renewal of my county recovery contract. Contract number RV-2012-041. The board chairman that year was a man named Lonnie Driscoll. Lonnie Driscoll had been county fleet manager for 22 years. He had a way of signing documents that told you he'd already decided before the meeting started. He picked up the renewal denial and signed it with 2 strokes of his pen. He didn't look up. He said, "Mr. Callahan, your primary vehicle is a 1948 Autocar wrecker." He said it like that settled something. He passed the denial across the table. I took it. I read it. The stated reason was fleet modernization standards requiring all contracted recovery vehicles to be model year 2000 or newer. I read it a second time. My daughter Patricia was in the truck outside. She was 9 years old that February. She had a book in her lap and the heat running. She knew I would be calm. She had never seen me be anything else. Lonnie Driscoll said, "You've got a fine old machine. But the county can't put its liability on equipment that old. That's just the reality." His deputy, a young man named Callum Reese, was writing something in his notepad. He did not look up either. He said quietly to the person next to him, "He brought the museum piece." Lonnie Driscoll smiled at that. He said, "Mr. Callahan, I'd encourage you to consider investing in modern equipment. There's no shame in it." I said, "Thank you." I folded the denial letter. I put it in the inside pocket of my coat. I stood up. I left. I did not tell them what I had already found. I did not tell them what I had been keeping since 1991. I did not tell them about the folder behind the seat of my truck. Outside, Patricia put down her book. She said, "How did it go?" I started the engine. I said, "We'll see." She looked at me the way she always did when she knew I wasn't finished yet. She was right. Lonnie Driscoll walked back to his office, feeling like a man who'd handled something cleanly. He told his deputy the contract was closed. He said, "He'll retire that truck inside a year. They always do." Callum Reese nodded. Neither of them knew about the National Archives. Neither of them knew about the Army Ordnance Department documents I had requested in 1991 and received in a brown envelope 4 weeks later. Neither of them knew about the performance logs I had kept in a manila folder since 1987. Every job, every recovery, every terrain condition, organized by date and indexed by vehicle. They signed the denial and moved on to the next item. I drove home through the county with the denial letter in my coat pocket and my daughter asking if she could change the radio station. I said yes. She found something she liked. We drove 38 miles without me saying another word. My wife Helen was in the kitchen when I got home. She asked what the board said. I took the denial letter out of my coat pocket. I set it on the kitchen table. I looked at it for a long time. There was a date in the upper right corner of the letter. There was a statute reference in paragraph 3. There was a case number in the footer that I had seen before. Not on this document. Somewhere else. Somewhere I had been keeping very carefully. Helen asked, "Roy, what did they say?" I folded the letter back along its original crease. I put it in the folder I kept on the corner of the table. I said, "They said no." She waited. I said nothing else. I was already 3 moves ahead. Before this goes any further, hit subscribe. Because what Roy found in that folder is something nobody on that procurement board ever thought to look for. And when it comes out, everything changes. Don't go anywhere. I went back to work the next morning. Life didn't stop because Lonnie Driscoll signed a piece of paper. I ran my calls. I picked up Patricia at 3:15 on school days. I made dinner at 6. I went to bed at 10. But after dinner, at the kitchen table, I read. Helen noticed by the end of the first week. She didn't ask directly. She made coffee and set it next to me and sat down with her own book. That was how she was. I had 3 filing boxes stacked against the wall by the kitchen door. I had been building them for years. Box 1, National Archives Correspondence, 1991 to 1994. Box 2, SAE Technical Papers and Performance Cross-References. Box 3, My Job Logs, 1987 to present, sorted by year. The denial letter from Lonnie Driscoll sat in a new folder I labeled RV 2012-041. I read the County Procurement Statute first, Kentucky Revised Statute 45A. 080 covered county procurement eligibility. I read it carefully. I read it again. I wrote down section numbers in my notebook with a mechanical pencil. The notebook was a black hardcover, college ruled, the same kind I'd used since 1988. I was on my 14th. The courthouse law library opened at 8 in the morning. I was there on a Saturday 3 weeks after the denial. The room was in the basement. The fluorescent lights were old and one of them flickered in the corner. It smelled like old paper and something else. Dust and lemon cleaner, and the particular smell of documents that haven't been touched in a long time. There were microfiche machines along one wall. There were wooden card catalog drawers that nobody used anymore. There were binders on metal shelves labeled by year. I started with 1995. I worked forward. Patricia was with her aunt that Saturday. Helen had asked if I wanted company. I said, I'll be more useful alone. She understood. I pulled binders. I made copies at 20 cents a page on a machine that hummed and smelled like warm toner. I put the copies in my folder. I wrote down case numbers. I cross-referenced. I went home at 4:30. Helen said, "What are you looking for?" I said, "Something they missed." She said, "Will you tell me?" I said, "When I know, you'll know." She made dinner. Patricia came home at 5. She saw the copies on the table. She said, "Are you doing homework, Dad?" I said, "Something like that." She said, "Is it for us?" I said, "Yes." She went to do her own homework. That was enough for her. The weeks went on like that. Evenings at the table. Saturdays at the courthouse library. Tuesdays at the county assessor's office. Pulling procurement history from years I needed. The assessor's clerk was a young woman who didn't ask questions. She pulled whatever I asked for. She put it on the counter. I read it standing up. I made notes. I made copies. I filed them in order. What I was looking for was a specific kind of document. Not a policy, not a statute, a precedent. A prior ruling that addressed the exact question Lonnie Driscoll had decided without looking. I found the first piece on a Wednesday morning in a binder from 2003. An appeals board ruling. Case number PRB 2003-17. It was 9 pages long. It addressed a vendor eligibility dispute in Bell County. It said, in language that was plain, if you read it slowly enough, that a county procurement board could not deny contract renewal to a vendor on equipment age grounds without first establishing a documented safety deficiency in that specific piece of equipment. Not a general policy about age, a specific deficiency in that specific piece of equipment. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. I sat at the library table for a long moment. The fluorescent light in the corner flickered. The copy machine hummed. I thought about Lonnie Driscoll's signature. 2 strokes of a pen. I thought about how he hadn't asked me a single question about the Autocar's maintenance history. He hadn't asked about inspection records. He hadn't asked about job logs. He had signed based on the year stamped on the title. That was all. I went to the copy machine. I copied all 9 pages. I put them in my folder. I wrote PRB 2003-17 on the folder tab with the mechanical pencil. I drove home. Helen was at the kitchen table when I came in. She looked at my face. She said, "You found it." I said, "Part of it." She said, "Is it enough?" I thought about the job logs in box 3. 32 years of documented recovery work. Every terrain condition, every outcome, every maintenance record attached. No documented safety deficiency. Not once in 32 years. I said, "Not yet, but I know what else I need." I put the folder on the table. I sat down. Helen put her hand on my shoulder. I opened to the appeals board ruling and read it a 4th time. The precedent was clear. The statute was specific. The documentation existed. Now came the long part, the waiting. Year 1. Patricia turned 10 in February. I baked a cake and invited her school friends. I hung streamers in the kitchen doorway. I smiled the entire afternoon. That evening, after she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder. My lawyer, Carol Yates, called me that week. She said Lonnie Driscoll's office had reached out. They were offering to restore my contract with a modified age exception provision. She said, "Roy, that's essentially what you asked for." I said, "No." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because an exception isn't a ruling. An exception can be taken back." She said she would relay the message. Lonnie Driscoll's deputy called her the next day and increased the offer. A 3-year contract instead of 1. I said no again. Carol asked me if I was certain. I said I was. She said, "They're confused, Roy. They think they're being generous." I said, "I know." Year 2. Patricia was 11. She played junior varsity soccer that spring. I made every game. I stood on the sideline in my coat and watched her. She was fast and patient the way I had tried to teach her to be. She scored twice in the season and didn't celebrate much after either goal. She just ran back to position. Carol called again in autumn. The offer now included a 5-year contract, a rate increase, and priority call routing. Lonnie Driscoll's office could not understand why I kept saying no. Carol said, "Roy, I need to know what you're waiting for." I said something better. She said, "Better than a 5-year priority contract?" I said yes. She let out a breath, but she trusted me. Year 3. Lonnie Driscoll called me directly. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I drove to the diner on Route 421. He was already there when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered. He had a coffee cup in both hands. He said, "Roy, I want to understand what you want." I sat down. I ordered coffee. I said, "I want the age restriction policy removed from County Procurement Code. Formally, not an exception for me. Removed." He said, "I can't do that." I said, "I know." He looked at me. He said, "Then what will make this go away?" I said, "Nothing you're offering." He pushed back from the table slightly. He said he'd been in procurement for 24 years. He said he'd never dealt with a vendor who refused to settle. I drank my coffee. I said, "I'm not settling because I don't have to." He didn't know what that meant. I let him not know. Year 4. Patricia was 13. She had started helping me organize the filing boxes on weekends. She didn't know what they were for. She just sorted and labeled the way I asked. One afternoon, she held up the folder marked PRB-2003-17. She said, "Dad, why do you have so many papers about old trucks?" I said, "To help us." She said, "Are we in trouble?" I said, "No." She said, "Then why?" I said, "Because I know something, and eventually the right person will need to know it too." She put the folder back. She believed me without understanding. She always had. Year 5. Lonnie Driscoll retired in the spring. His replacement was a woman named Sandra Holt. Sandra Holt came from Louisville. She had never heard of me. She read the file. She called Carol within 3 weeks. Carol called me. Carol said, "They want to negotiate, not offer. Negotiate." I said, "It's time." Year 6. Sandra Holt's procurement attorney contacted Carol in January. He said, "What does your client want? Tell us what he wants and we'll give it to him." Carol said, "He wants what he's always wanted, a formal policy revision. No vendor excluded from county contracts based on equipment age without documented specific safety deficiency." The attorney went quiet. He called back 2 days later. He said Sandra Holt had reviewed the appeals board precedent from 2003. Carol said to me afterward, "He said they found a ruling that makes the current policy hard to defend." I said, "I know." She said, "You've had that ruling for how long?" I said, 6 years. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "You could have brought this immediately." I said, "I could have, but I wanted the whole case built, not just one precedent. Everything." She said, "Roy, how much do you have?" I said, "Enough." She said, "Are you ready?" I folded the phone against my ear. I thought about Patricia at 10 years old sorting folders on a Saturday afternoon. I thought about 32 years of job logs and the copy machine in the courthouse basement and the smell of old documents. I thought about what Lonnie Driscoll had said in room 14B. "There's no shame in it. Carol's phone rang. Sandra Holt's attorney wanted to discuss terms. I said, now we can talk. The meeting was held in a conference room at the county attorney's office on a Tuesday in March. The table was long and wooden and cold to the touch. Sandra Holt sat across from me. Her attorney sat beside her. Carol sat beside me. I had the folder. I set it on the table. Sandra Holt looked older than her photograph in the county directory. Her attorney was a young man named Briggs who kept clicking his pen. The county attorney's paralegal asked if we were ready to begin. Carol said yes. I said nothing. Carol opened the folder. She said, Your Honor, for the purposes of this proceeding, we'd like to present the basis for Mr. Callahan's position. Briggs said, We're prepared to offer a permanent contract renewal with an age exception clause. Carol said, That's not what we're asking for. She laid the first document on the table. She said, In 2003, the Kentucky Procurement Appeals Board ruled in case PRB 2003-17 that a county may not deny contract renewal to a vendor on equipment age grounds absent a documented safety deficiency in the specific piece of equipment in question. Not a general policy, a specific deficiency. She slid the ruling across the table. Briggs picked it up. His pen stopped clicking. He read the first page. He read the second. Sandra Holt looked at him. He didn't look up. Carol laid the second document on the table. She said Mr. Callahan's 1948 Autocar wrecker has been inspected annually since 1987. Here are 32 years of maintenance logs, inspection records, and a third-party load certification from 2001, rating the vehicle's boom at 110% of its stated capacity. She laid the logs on the table. They were thick. They made a sound when they landed. Briggs set down the ruling. He looked at the logs. He said, When did you compile all of this? I said, 1987. He said, You've been building this since... Carol said, Since the first time someone told him the truck was too old. The paralegal was writing. Sandra Holt said quietly, This ruling is binding? Carol said, It has never been overturned. It applies to every county in this state. The age restriction language in Harlan County's current procurement code is not defensible under this precedent. The room was quiet. Briggs leaned over and said something to Sandra Holt in a low voice. She nodded once. She looked at me. She said, What exactly are you asking for? I said, Remove the age restriction language from county procurement code. Replace it with a requirement for documented specific safety deficiency. Apply it to all vendors going forward, she said. Not just you, I said. Not just me. She looked at the logs. She looked at the ruling. She said, If we don't agree, Carol said, we file for formal procurement review with the state board. Under PRB Tonado 317, the current policy fails. We will win. The question is only whether you'd prefer to change the policy today or be ordered to change it in 12 months. Briggs put the ruling down. He didn't say anything. Sandra Holt looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, We'll need 30 days to draft the revision. Carol said, We'll accept 30 days. I said nothing. I didn't smile. I didn't say I told you so. I watched Sandra Holt pick up the appeals board ruling and read it one more time, slowly. And I watched the moment she understood that Lonnie Driscoll had signed a denial letter 6 years ago without ever checking whether the legal basis for that denial existed. It didn't. It never had. We walked out of the county attorney's office at 11:47 in the morning. The sun was out. Carol shook my hand on the sidewalk. She said, You were right. The entire time, you were right. I said, Yes. She said, 6 years, Roy. I said, The truck is 75. 6 years is nothing. I drove to Patricia's school. She was 16 now. She came out the front doors with her bag on one shoulder and got in the truck the way she had since she was 9 years old. She looked at me. She said, What happened? I said, We won. She said, What does that mean? I said, It means the old way still works. And now everybody knows it. She looked at the folder on the seat between us. She had seen it for 7 years. She had sorted its contents on Saturday afternoons. She said, That folder? I said, That folder. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew you had something. I pulled out onto the road. I said, I know you did. We drove home. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table. Helen sat beside me. The folder was in front of me. Inside, the appeals board ruling, the maintenance logs, the 2001 certification, the Army Ordnance documents, the SAE papers, the job logs going back to 1987. Every piece of every argument I had built over 32 years, kept in the same kind of black folder I had been using since before Patricia was born. Helen put her hand on my shoulder. She said, "You did it." I said, "We did." I closed the folder. I stood up. I crossed to the shelf on the wall by the window, the shelf where Helen kept her good dishes, and the photograph of Patricia at age 6, sitting in the cab of the autocar, with her hands on the steering wheel. I set the folder on the shelf, not in my coat pocket anymore, not behind the seat of the truck, on the shelf, where it stayed. 32 years of patience, filed and finished. Outside, in the yard, the autocar sat in the evening light. 75 years old and ready to work tomorrow. Proof that the quiet men, the ones who read carefully, who document everything, who never explain themselves more than once, are not the ones who lose. They are the ones who wait until the truth is unavoidable. And then, they let the folder do the talking. The policy was revised 41 days later. Roy Callahan's county contract was renewed. No equipment age restriction appears in Harlan County Procurement Code to this day.